Thanks to all of you who are here today to share in one of the things that I'm really passionate about in Toastmasters, which is evaluation. So the first question I want to pose to you is, why do we evaluate speeches? There are several main reasons, 4 actually. Firstly, we want to motivate the speaker to continue on in their journey. We want to praise the strengths that they already have, and also to identify areas where they may need some improvement. And lastly, we want to encourage them and praise them and reinforce the desire to keep making speeches. What do great evaluators do well? Firstly, they have great listening skills. I admit, as a university student, I was a terrible listener. I find that a very difficult skill to master. However, because I do a lot of evaluations now, it's really honed my listening skills. So that is a great thing, not just when listening to speeches, but also when communicating with people in the workplace as well. They are good at taking notes. Clearly, it's not our job as an evaluator to write down every single word that a speaker says. But what we want to do is make notes of the things that they've done well and the things where we are going to suggest improvement to craft our speech evaluation speech. This one is a really important one as well. So I noticed that we have a few DTMs here today. We have Alan Ang from Brunei. Now let's imagine that I just watched his speech and now I'm going to evaluate it. Alan Ang, DTM, he's a former district director. He's a public speaking coach. He's a trainer. You know, he's just such an incredible person. How can I even evaluate him? That is really not the approach that we should take in as an evaluator. I'm not evaluating Alan on his credentials and his background and his past speeches. I'm evaluating him on the speech he's giving today. There are a couple of exceptions to that. There is one speech project where you are supposed to you're supposed to be given critiques that you then incorporate into your next speech. So that would be an exception to that. But generally, we don't look at the credentials of a speaker. We look at what they've presented on the occasion in question. It's always important to be sincere. I've been in quite a few competitions where the speech evaluation contestant has really engaged in what I would call they are showing off their skills as an evaluator rather than making the evaluation about the speaker. From my perspective, our evaluation is always about the speaker. It's not an opportunity for us. Although having said that, we should also take note that we need to present a well-crafted evaluation speech. And the familiar sandwich method. I'm sure everyone here today has heard of the sandwich method. And in fact, I use that as a lecturer. I use this method when I'm critiquing my students, and they always appreciate the fact that I have used this method. I've started with something that complements them, and then the meat in the middle, those are the recommendations. Where do we want the speaker to improve? And then we finish on a high note with some kind of encouragement. This is kind of a boring looking sandwich, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'll eat it if I'm hungry, but it doesn't look all that appealing. As an evaluator, I want to build a more interesting and exciting sandwich, which gives more value to the speaker that I'm evaluating. So this is my evaluation sandwich. It looks much more delicious. It's got wholemeal bread, it's got lots of salad, it's got mayonnaise, mustard, chilies, anything that you could possibly want. How do we do this? How do we build a better evaluation sandwich that gives extra value to the speaker? And that's what we're here for today. What should you include in your evaluations to give added value? I'm going to be speaking about a few different things. Firstly, speech organization. Then I'll go on to speech mechanics and the use of language. Then I will look at body language and gestures. And very briefly, I will look at the power of stories. Before I go on to the next part of this session, one thing that I always do is I keep a notebook. And this notebook is what I like to call my evaluation toolkit. So I've actually got my notebook into 5 or 6 different sections. And when I give evaluations, perhaps and I say something about the speech organization, I will write it down in my notebook. Or if I hear another evaluator say something that I want to tailor-make for future speeches, I also make note of that. So then when I'm listening to speeches, I'm always filling in my notebook. That is my toolkit. And I encourage everyone today to do that as well. It really helps. If you're listening to a speech and they've said something really amazing in the introduction, but you don't quite know what to say, go to your toolkit and you'll have some phrases there ready to assist you. For speech organization, it's very much like an essay that we all did at school or at university. It should have an opening, a body, and a conclusion. When it comes to the opening, we talk about the all-important first 7 seconds. We usually have about 7 to 10 seconds to make a good first impression. What I look for is whether the speaker started their speech with what public speakers call the hook. Did the speaker engage the audience right from the get-go? Did they use a catchy opening? That is what really sets up a speaker to deliver a wonderful speech. I've seen some speakers come onto the stage or onto the Zoom environment and start fiddling with their clothes or, fussing with their hair or looking nervously around. It doesn't create a good first impression. So that is the first thing that as an evaluator, you can take note of. I'm going to share with you a short video now of a young man named Joshua Chutan. He's delivering a 3-minute thesis at the Australian National University. We are not going to listen to the whole 3 minutes. The title of his speech is Targeting the Root of Vision Loss. So he's talking about people who are prematurely losing their eyesight. I'm just going to get you to look at the introduction of his speech, and I want you to think about your overall impression of his confidence level and the way in which he started his speech. If you have any comments, do drop them in the chat box and we can have a look at those later as well.
If I asked everyone here to think about the one sense that you couldn't live without, I'm willing to bet that most of you would have immediately thought of your sight. That's because our vision and what we see plays such an integral role into how we perceive the world around us.
So that was the introduction. It was about 10 seconds. What did he do you think, that was very successful? For me, he got us to think about what is the one sense that we would not like to be without. And then he said, he takes a gamble. He says, I'm willing to bet it would be your vision. I think that's a really clever opening because it primes the audience to start thinking about the importance of vision in our lives. And then he goes on to build content and talk about premature vision loss. So that is something where I would definitely give great points to this speaker for his opening, and I would definitely comment on it in my evaluation. If I really like the opening, I have a few samples of commendations. I really love the way you led with a cleverly crafted rhetorical question. Notice I put here cleverly crafted. There are some rhetorical questions which aren't very clever at all. For example, who likes going on a holiday? Let's see a show of hands. Yeah, it's not very clever, is it? It's a question, but I think the audience will be like, oh, it's, of course we like going on holidays. It's a bit too average, I believe. Something better could be something like, how many of you love solo traveling? That's a more provocative question, and it's a bit more engaging for the audience as well. A challenging statement. Solving world hunger is within our reach. That's a very provocative statement, because if it is within our reach, why do we have so many hungry people around? So that's really going to get the audience interested to start thinking, wow, if it is possible, how is this speaker going to develop this argument about solving world hunger? It makes us interested. Quotations, illustrations, and also humor. I haven't included a lot of focus on the point of view of humor in today's workshop, but certainly people who are comfortable including humor in the introduction and in their speech. I think the audience loves humor. And if you can include something in an introduction that is humorous, all the better. What about if the speaker didn't quite hit the mark with their opening? What sort of recommendations would I make? You seem to be a little nervous. I would like to recommend you start with a power pose. What is the power pose? Well, okay, let me give you an example. If you're sitting on your chair right now, I want you to kind of push yourself to the edge of your chair, so your bottom is just on the chair, and then put your hands on your hips with your shoulders wide apart. This is what we call a power pose, and it sets up a speaker to be confident. It opens up the lungs and the chest. It makes your head sit at the proper position on top of your body, and it makes you ready to speak. It is a big boost of confidence for a speaker. We can do that at the beginning of a speech to give ourselves that little energy shot. Or if the speaker didn't start with a quotation, then you could recommend that they do. There are some quotations that are perfect for different types of speeches. Perhaps you could consider starting your speech with a funny anecdote. So these are some of the things that I would say to a speaker who didn't quite hit the mark with the opening of their speech. Let's have a look at a winning introduction. Now, this is one of my all-time favorite introductions. I don't know how many times I've watched it, but every single time I just marvel in the brilliance of it. So let me introduce to you now Muhammad Katani, The Power of Words.
Please welcome our next contestant, Muhammad Katani, The Power of Words.
Can you see it okay?
The Power of Words, Muhammad Katani.
Okay, so that was his introduction. I honestly believe he won the contest that day just based on this first 10 seconds of his speech. What did he do that was so brilliant? He entered the stage, he was poised, confident, comfortable. He took his time. He stood his ground, where he stood exactly where he wanted to stand. He owned the stage. He took some time to look around, and then very calmly and collectedly, he reached into his pocket for a cigarette. Completely outrageous behavior for a speaker at a conference in a crowded auditorium, isn't it? But that's why this is such a successful introduction. It was unexpected. If you are evaluating a speech and the speaker missed the mark with the introduction, you can always get them to have a look at this speech. Now, I'm not encouraging people to take out cigarettes on stage, but certainly it is the high bar mark for speech introductions. So let's go on now to the body of the speech. If someone is delivering a speech of 5 to 7 minutes, we do expect them to have 3 main points, and those main points should have subpoints and illustrations. As an example, imagine someone is delivering a speech about solo traveling. So point 1 could be the person's first experience with solo traveling. The subpoint and illustration could be how they lost their passport and got food poisoning. Then they could tell us about their second experience where they had better planning and it was successful. And the third point could be, what did they learn through their experiences that they're now going to share with us? And those could be planning, adaptability, and fun. One thing to look at with the body of the speech, were there three clear points? Were they well illustrated? Were there transitions between the points? Was the speech well balanced? You don't want half or 3/4 of the speech to be about the disastrous first solo traveling adventure. You want it to be well balanced. So the disastrous one, the good one, and then the things learned. So there should be a balance between each of the points. How do we transition from point to point? It is a bit easier in a face-to-face meeting when you're presenting from a stage area because the speaker can move from one part of the stage to another to demonstrate that they're transitioning from point to point. In a Zoom environment, we need to use transitional words or signposts. If I want to commend a speaker who presents a well-organized speech, I will say something like this. Because of the effort in crafting your speech so well, your audience found your speech easy to understand, or you appeared credible and believable. Those are the sorts of things that I would like to say to someone who takes the effort to well craft their speech. I just mentioned the transitions and signposts. If they didn't use these, you can recommend that they do so. Using words, language to indicate to the audience that they are moving on to the next point. For example, well, that was my awful experience about solo traveling. Now I'm going to tell you about my next trip, something like that. So the audience is like, okay, that part's over. We're ready to hear about the next trip. Remember that when delivering a speech, the speaker it's not like an essay. We can't go back and read the previous paragraph. So we need the speaker to help us to navigate through the speech using these signposts. And what about the conclusion? Was there a star moment? Was there something they'll always remember? STAR, something they'll always remember. Was there a wow moment in the conclusion? Was there a takeaway message? Something that the audience will take home with them and think about. Now, look at it this way. As a public speaker, what we really want to do is we want to plant a memory of our speech in the minds of our audience. And how do we do that? We do it by ending on a wow, ending on a high moment. It's like the famous expression, people will forget what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. How did the speaker make you feel at the end of the speech? So that is the wow moment. And that's what speakers should really do to end on a high. If there is a conclusion that I've really liked, I will commend the speaker on that. I love the way you made use of the final opportunity in your speech to convey your message and make your speech memorable. That is my commendation. If I feel that the conclusion was not powerful enough, there was no wow moment, I will give a recommendation. I would like to see you end with a memorable statement, a quote, or a call to action. So those are some of the things that you can consider for your recommendations if the conclusion did not quite hit the mark. So let me move on now to speech mechanics and language. I'm going to be talking about vocal variety and eye contact in this part of the session. Vocal variety, I usually try to remember it as the 4 Ps, just in case I get to a meeting or a contest and I've forgotten what I need to think about. It's always good to have a mnemonic device like the 4 Ps. The pace, which is, Uncle Mike will call that the fast, slow, the pitch, the high, low, the power, the power is the volume of the speech and the pauses. So let's have a look at the pace. How fast should someone speak? Now, if we are talking to an audience which is mixed in terms of English language ability, then around 130, 140 words per minute is just nice. Any faster and the audience won't keep up. And any slower, we're going to feel a bit sleepy listening to it. But of course, having said that, the speaker should also use variations in pace as well. It's important not to have the same pace consistently throughout the whole of the speech. I'm now going to share with you a speaker who uses variations in pace. I want you to take note of where she slows down, where she speeds up, and where she slows down again. Michelle Obama is up next. I think this is all the Donald Trump supporters are going to be exiting the room right now. So get ready for Michelle Obama. I'm just dragging this forward a little bit. Here we go.
If we want to give all of our children a foundation for their dreams and opportunities worthy of their promise, if we want to give them that sense of limitless possibility, that belief that here in America, there is always something better out there if you're willing to work for it, then we must work like never before.
So you will notice
he cared that it was the right thing.
There is always something better out there if you were willing to work for it. She was speeding up in that part. And then when she got to the main message that she wants us to take home, she said slowly, then we must work like never before. So she delivered the main message of her speech in a slow and more careful pace of speech. So do take note when you're listening to a speaker, did they give variations of pace to add interest to their speech and also to signal to the audience that the slower, more metered pace is the important part of the speech? When should we use a high-pitched voice and a high-toned voice? Well, you can imagine if you're being told you've just won a Grammy, then you would have a high pitch and a high tone. If you're being chased by a dog or a tiger or a lion, you would have a high pitch or a high tone. But do remember that a high pitch or a high tone, if used by a speaker for too long, can be quite draining and in fact quite annoying for the audience. So the high pitch, the high tone is very appropriate to show excitement, surprise, expectation. You can always recommend that a speaker use a higher pitch and a higher tone at certain parts of their speech. And then there is also the low pitch, the low tone, the serious voice, like Mufasa from The Lion King. You notice that when speakers want to deliver the main part of their speech, that's when they should use not just a slower pace, a lower pitch, a lower tone. If the speaker has not done that in their speech, this is a perfect area for you to add in your recommendations in your speech evaluation. The power of your voice. How loud should it be? How soft should it be? Well, this all depends on if we are in an audience environment, in a face-to-face meeting, or whether we are on Zoom. Of course, if we are on Zoom, then we could have a louder voice if we want to show something exciting. And then we can go into a lower voice to show more vulnerability or caution, for example. So these are the 4 Ps, end with the pauses, the power of the pause, I like to call it. And as Mark Twain said, no word was ever as effective as a rightly timed pause. Pauses are like punctuation in an essay. They are little spaces that we purposely create in a speech to allow the audience to think about what we've said or even engage with what we're about to say. Let me give you an example. One thing I've noticed about evaluators is they'll always say this: you should have more pauses. And it's probably true. It's not very helpful, however, to just tell a speaker to add more pauses. So what I like to do is this. I like to recommend the types of pauses that the speaker could use. For example, one type of pause is an expectation pause. Let's say that a speaker has delivered a speech where they repeat a certain phrase several times. For example, let's go traveling, let's go traveling, let's go traveling. They've said it 4 or 5 times in their speech, which is great. What they could do, however, is on the 3rd time, they could say, let's go, with a rising intonation, and leave a space, leave a pause. And the audience can fill in the blank. The audience will come back with the word traveling because they've already been primed that that's the word that's going to come next. So that is what we call an expectation pause. Recommend that to a speaker who has used a certain phrase several times in their speech. Why is this a good thing? Because it engages the audience. It makes the audience feel like they're part of this conversation that the speaker is having with them. The other type of more commonly used pause is, of course, the reflection pause, which comes at the end of a statement. Some speakers, I feel like they're afraid to have long pauses. It might make them feel like they're not confident and not poised. But let's have a look at a speaker who makes really effective use of long pauses. So I'm going to be now sharing a snippet of a speech from one of my favorite speakers, Dhananjaya, former world champion. In his speech, his championship winning speech, let's have a look at his use of pauses. And also when he pauses, try to count off on your finger how long he actually pauses for.
You and I are not very different from this flower. Just like this flower is unique, you are unique. All of us have something special that makes us
So there, just a small snippet of his speech. You can always go back and have a look at that again. He is the first place winner of the World Championship of Public Speaking. What did he do really well? He wasn't afraid to pause. When he said, just like this flower is unique, he paused for a good full 2 seconds. You are unique, another pause. And that gives the audience an opportunity to think about ourselves and our uniqueness. That is what makes his speech very successful. The power of the pause. If you see a speaker who doesn't pause enough, rather than just saying you need to add more pauses, try to give a more meaty evaluation and let them know exactly where the pauses would be of help in their speech. I'm just going to move on quickly now to eye contact. This, of course, also depends on whether you're in a face-to-face environment or whether you are in Zoom. Of course, if you're on a stage area, which I hope we all will be again very soon, you will look at all parts of the audience and, let your eyes lay on different parts of the audience throughout your speech. Some speakers speak to one part of the audience, and hopefully a room design is set up so that you can actually make good eye contact with all of the audience. But how do we make eye contact in Zoom? We look at the camera. I see some speakers maybe with a prepared speech, and they've got it like at the side and they're like reading from their notes and they're looking this way, or they're trying to recall their speech that they've memorized. So they're like looking up and to the left or up and to the right. It's really important to encourage the speaker to look at the camera on the laptop when they are doing their speech. That is how we make eye contact in the Zoom environment. Body language. Movement by the speaker can either reinforce the speech or it can be completely distracting. I always like to recommend to a speaker that they control their use of the floor space by synchronizing their movement with the verbal part of their speech. And that also includes incorporating facial expressions. I'm looking for one synchronized whole, which means the words, the facial expressions, and the movements should all be complementary to each other. And also power poses can be used to deliver the message of the speech. It doesn't have to be a really strong power pose. By just drawing our hands to our hips even gently, we get a boost of energy, we reinvigorate ourselves, and we let the audience know, yeah, this is the important part. Take note of this. Sometimes you don't need words. You can tell exactly what's happening. A picture paints 1,000 words. You know what's happening just by observing the body language. And again, we can tell immediately who's confident and who's not. So assess the body language that the speaker has used. Have they shown confidence? Have they shown that they're in control? Or are they perhaps stooped forward a little bit? But having said that, if the speaker wants to show a particular part of the speech where they're emotional or vulnerable, then certainly moving forward a little bit is appropriate. Gestures can also be distracting, or they can complement the speech message. How can a speaker show a big idea? It's very easy on a stage. You can wave your arms into a big movement, but that tends to be very distracting in Zoom. It creates shadowing and distraction. So you really need to keep your hands in front of your body on Zoom, but you can show a big idea like this in front of your body. How do you show confidence? Again, with the power pose. Even on Zoom, you can have your hands on your hips. Openness is hands out and forward. Sincerity could be putting your hand on your heart. And vulnerability, this is the time where it would be appropriate to sort of slump forward slightly. So if the speaker is talking about a vulnerable time in their life, do their gestures mimic that message? Did they show vulnerability with their gestures, or were they like standing confidently and talking about a terrible time in their life? So we're looking to see whether the gestures supported the speech message. Language. The next thing I'll talk about briefly is, did the speaker write for the ear? We don't really need to have a lot of long words in a speech. Short words, short sentences, short paragraphs are better. It's easier for everyone to understand. Did the speaker transition well? And did they use rhetorical devices? I'm going to speak a little bit about rhetorical devices now, because I think the other ones are very self-explanatory. Rhetorical devices. Now, if a speaker goes to the effort of putting these into their speech, then I think we should reward them for that in our evaluation, because these are not always easy to accomplish, but they certainly raise the bar on the level of the speech. Similes, metaphors, alliteration, the paradox, and the triad. So let me share a couple with you. Some of my favorites. The simile. A simile is where we compare two very different things, like the evening and a patient who is lying on a table under anesthetic. Now, these two things are completely different, but when you look at how T.S. Eliot draws them in to a simile, let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Really clever, isn't it? Now, certainly some of the speakers may not have that type of simile, but there are other similes that they will use in their speech. For example, his voice is like silk. If they do that, then by all means, take the effort to compliment them on that during your evaluation. All the world's a stage is a metaphor. A metaphor is something that's not literally true. For example, a world is not a stage, but William Shakespeare has said here that it is. So that is also a type of rhetorical or linguistic device. Alliteration is something which is repeated, and it's very musical to the ear. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping. So you see the alliteration with the end sound and also with the ing endings. It's rhythmical, it's pleasing to the audience. Even if the audience doesn't think, that was alliteration, their mind does register, wow, that was very pleasant sounding. A paradox, probably my favorite. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. How can it be both? A paradox is a seemingly contradictory statement that is put together, and it really engages the audience and gets them to start thinking, how is this going to be proven to me that times can be both best and worst simultaneously? And the triad, when shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain? Thunder, lightning, rain are all aspects of a storm. So that is Shakespeare using the triad. I'm now going to show you a brilliant use of rhetorical devices by a speaker, Ramona J. Smith, competing at the World Championship of Public Speaking with her speech still standing. I think I noticed 3 or 4 rhetorical devices just in her introduction. See if you can pick them up if you listen, as you listen.
Ramona J. Smith, still standing, Ramona J. Smith.
Sorry, what happened here? Yes, here she is.
Life will sometimes feel like a fight. The punches, jabs, and hooks will come in the form of challenges, obstacles, and failures. Yet if you stay in the ring and learn from those past fights, at the end of each round, you'll be still standing.
Did all of you notice the simile that she
Chair.
used? She started off with a simile, and then she used 2 sets of triads. She said punches, jabs, and hooks, and then she said challenges, obstacles, and failures. It is certainly possible for somebody to overuse rhetorical devices. Whether you think she did or not, that I'll leave that to you. But when she said life will sometimes feel like a fight, that is a classic example of a simile. So she has actually packed quite a lot of rhetorical devices into her introduction. And I'm now going to go
Ramon.
to the power of stories, just very, very quickly. Sometimes speakers use a very narrative approach to their speech. So they're explaining a situation, but they haven't incorporated stories. One thing that the human brain really loves is stories. Whenever I still remember as a little girl opening a book, reading the words once upon a time and feeling a sense of excitement because I knew that there would be princesses and dragons and all kinds of wonderful things about to happen. There's part of our primitive brain that still loves stories because stories predate writing. So like I'm from Australia, for example, the Aboriginal people 40,000 years ago were sharing the creation of the universe through stories that they passed on from generation to generation. That part of us still loves emotion, mystery, and description that comes with stories. So do encourage speakers to incorporate stories into their speech. I will now share a few things that I like to keep in my notebook, just in case I'm thinking, how am I going to structure my evaluation speech? If I'm going to commend someone, I would say something like, I really loved the opening of your speech. What I liked most about your speech was your speech crafting. You used your voice effectively in the upper register with a high tone and a high pitch to show surprise. Your gestures were effortless and graceful, and your use of pauses was excellent. For recommendations, these are some of the things I've heard said during evaluations. What you will notice here is that the language is negative. There is also a bit of a problem with the word you in English because you is quite accusatory. It sounds like we're accusing someone of something, especially if it's followed by a word like didn't. You didn't. It sounds like I'm scolding you. So if a speaker hears the words, you didn't pause enough, it sounds a bit like an accusation. So consider how you can convert these type of negative phrases into something a lot more positive. For example, I would like to suggest that you add more pauses, especially at the end of your main messages. Rather than moving too much around the stage, perhaps you could plant yourself in one part of the stage for the first part of your speech, and then move across the stage to show the audience that you're transitioning into your second point. I also feel that the word monotonous is not a good word to use in an evaluation because it sounds quite negative. It would be better to just say to the speaker, I would like to encourage you to add more vocal variety. For that part of the speech where you were talking to your grandmother, maybe your grandmother could have her own voice. That would be a great opportunity for you to add vocal variety and to add a character to your speech. At the end of my session today, I know I've taken up a bit too much time. A speech evaluation is a speech. It should have an introduction. It should have commendations. It should have recommendations, and it should end on a high with a conclusion. What do you want the speaker to remember about your evaluation at the end of your speech? So that is all for me right now.